Welcome to the Leading Faithful Innovation book launch. We are so excited to have you with us today. I am Dr. Alicia Granholm, Director of Operational Strategy for Luther Seminary's Faith+Lead, and I will be the webinar host today. And today I am joined by several colleagues that just wrote a book, and not only is it available right now, it's also the #1 release in religious leadership on Amazon. And I would love to take a moment to introduce you to them. Dr. Dwight Zscheile, our Vice President of Innovation and Professor of Congregational Mission and Leadership at Luther Seminary. Michael Binder, the Assistant Professor of Congregational Mission and Leadership at Luther Seminary, and Tessa Pinkstaff, our Faith+Lead Academy Program and Live Learning Manager. We are so excited that you have taken time out of your very busy schedule to join us today. Our hope for you today is that when what we share during our webinar and when you leave, it will help frame the challenges being experienced in ministry right now, that you will feel encouraged, that you will not feel alone, and that you will discover a hopeful and energizing way forward, not just for yourself, but also for your congregation, your judicatory, and your community. For our time together today, here is where we're going and how we're going to spend it. We'll open with the time of prayer in just a moment. We'll talk about what faithful innovation is and why it even matters. We'll look at faithful innovation in context with some guests that will be joining us today. We'll share some opportunities for next steps for you, and then we'll have time for a Q&A at the end as well. When you have any questions during the webinar, go ahead and type them into the Q&A section in your Zoom controls. And if there's a question in the Q&A section that you also would like answered, go ahead and like it. And if you can't find the Q&A button, that is okay. Simply go ahead and put your questions in the chat and we'll move them over there for the end of the webinar. We are recording this webinar today. So in a couple days, we'll be sending an email out to everyone that registered with the recording, as well as links that we mentioned throughout the webinar to resources that are also be available to you. And with that, I would love to invite Tessa to pray for our time together and to open us up in sharing why we are so excited about the opportunity to put this book not only into your hands, but in hands of people around the globe for the sake of the gospel today. Tessa?
Thank you so much, Alicia, and welcome everyone. Please join me as I open our time in prayer. Gracious God, thank you for this day and for everyone joining us, for my co-authors, for our guests and hosts, and for everyone who is here with us on this webinar. Thank you for the ways you are leading each one of us in our lives, in our ministries, and in our communities. I pray that you would speak today and that you would give us ears to hear your voice. We offer this time to you, trusting in the movement of your Spirit and asking these things in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, I would like to get us started with why all of this matters right now. I think that we can agree that we're in a time of profound disorientation. And some of this stems from the pandemic, like how we are still trying to find the new normal of ministry and what that looks like in a post-pandemic environment. But you know, the reality is that this disorientation started long before the pandemic. It just got accelerated, it got speeded up over the past 3 years. But we were already seeing an unraveling of inherited ministry models. And what that means is that the old ways of doing church, these old ways that had been accepted and common for most of our lifetimes, these old ways are no longer working. The old way of doing ministry is no longer connecting with people. Dwight is going to share more about this in a moment, but what I want you to know is what this means for ministry leaders and what it might mean for you is that you might be experiencing an increase in feelings of isolation, of disconnection, of distraction, of depletion. And this could show up in a variety of ways. This could be a low-level unease that's in the background for you each day. You might know deep down that things aren't right, and the challenges that we're facing have no easy answers. What I'm talking about is not solvable with a new program, a new way of marketing your church, or even with a refresh of your leadership team. The old maps, the old ways of doing church are far less helpful now. So what we're talking about with faithful innovation is new. It's a new way of thinking, a new way of being church that involves looking forward to God's hopeful future, while at the same time looking back to the treasures of the church's past. And here's a key thing. At the center of all of this is the Holy Spirit, leading and guiding and bringing us and our congregations into the hope that God offers to us. So in our book, Leading Faithful Innovation, we found that the story of Paul's second missionary journey, and in particular, his encounter with a woman named Lydia in the book of Acts, this story was especially helpful for framing this new way of being church. Lydia was a Gentile businesswoman who met Paul and his companions, and Lydia was several firsts. Lydia was not only the first European convert to Christianity, but Lydia was also the founder of the church in Philippi. Lydia represents the people in our communities and our neighborhoods who are spiritually curious, who are searching for something that they might not be able to find in the walls of the church. After all, as we'll see in a moment, Lydia encountered Paul and the gospel Paul shared, not in the synagogue, but at the river, at a place of prayer outside the traditional religious structures of the city. So we are talking outside the walls of the church. This story from Acts also reveals the way that Paul and his fellow travelers listened and responded to the Holy Spirit, moving from place to place and taking less obvious routes as God led and instructed them through the power of the Spirit. And they end up in the city of Philippi, which in the map on your screen, you'll see the city of Philippi near the top. The careful listening that Paul and his companions did, the listening to God's Spirit, is central to the faithful innovation process. And so this story of Lydia is very, very important to us. And to help us get set up for the rest of what we want to share with you today, I'm going to read this story briefly for us. And the story comes from Acts 16, verses 6 through 15. So as I read this, I invite you to put yourself in the story. Imagine what God was up to as this journey was taking place. Just imagine God's activity and how the Holy Spirit was moving. So I'll read this for us. Paul and his companions went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. When they had come opposite Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. So, passing by Mysia, they went down to Troas. During the night, Paul had a vision. There stood a man of Macedonia, pleading with him and saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." When he had seen the vision, we immediately tried to cross over to Macedonia, being convinced that God had called us to proclaim the good news to them. We therefore set sail from Troas and took a straight course to Samothrace, the following day to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is a leading city in the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. We remained in this city for some days. On the Sabbath, we went outside the gate by the river, where we supposed there was a place of prayer. And we sat down and spoke to the women who had gathered there. A certain woman named Lydia, a worshiper of God, was listening to us. She was from the city of Thyatira and a dealer in purple cloth. The Lord opened her heart to listen eagerly to what was said by Paul. When she and her household were baptized, she urged us, saying, "If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come and stay at my home." And she prevailed upon us. So, as we sit with this story, as we hold it in our minds and in our hearts, I want to invite Michael to share some of the key questions that emerged for us, key questions that form the foundation of the faithful innovation process. So, Michael, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Tessa. Glad to be with you all today. Yeah, so these are some important questions that came out of this story and a lot of our experiences in working with congregations and thinking about faithful innovation over the last 10 or 15 years. The first one is just, how do we discover a hopeful future when we don't know where we're going? And that's probably my favorite part of this text, is that Paul and his companions, they know what they're called to do. They know they're trying to share the gospel in communities that haven't heard it before, but they really have no idea where they're going, as evidenced by that zigzag line on that map. They're just trying to find the spot where God wants them to share what they're up to. And so there's a lot of resonance with that, with where we are today, where there's a lot of congregations, people, Christians too, like we don't exactly know where we're going next. And the way that we've been doing things isn't working in the same way it used to. And so that's our starting place. Second question, how do we follow the Spirit of God when the outcomes aren't clear ahead of time? And any of you who have tried to lead in congregational life know it's very hard to help people come together and follow a path when you don't know where the path ends. And so there's some anxiety with that. There's some uncertainty with that. But the reality is we don't exactly know where God might be leading us in the 21st century. And so the question is, how do we follow? Like, how do we listen? How do we discern? How do we follow God's leading when we're not exactly sure where we're supposed to end up? And then finally, how can we learn to be led by the Spirit, especially in Western cultural contexts, where most people's default in daily life is to, as we put it, seek the good without God? People don't all assume that God's leading them every day. That's a kind of weird thing to say in most Western cultural contexts. So how do we learn to be led by God amidst friends and neighbors and coworkers who might think it's weird that we're looking for God's leadership at all in our everyday life? And that's an important piece of faithful innovation.
So I want to invite us into a little bit of thinking about some of the reasons for the sense of disorientation that Tessa mentioned earlier. And I want to just offer a brief framework here and then talk also about why this is such a great time actually to be the church and to be in ministry. So I'm drawing here on the work of Ted Smith and Charles Taylor, but we might say that beginning in the early 1800s, in America at least, there was a way of organizing church that emerged out of what had previously been the state church model that was based on voluntary associations. And it's not just church, it was also all kinds of other organizations in American society that were designed and organized where people would voluntarily join and become members and then support these organizations with their time, talent, and treasure, right, as is often said, as ways to connect, find belonging, find community, and then actually accomplish things in the world. And in that age of association model of church, there's a whole business model based on member donations, tithing, volunteerism, things like that. It assumes a culture of institutional trust. And out of this emerged the professional model of ministry, as well as the denominations. Like denominationalism is a product of this period, right? So the age of association is what we have had for the last couple of centuries in American Christianity as fairly normal. However, starting in the 1960s, as Charles Taylor talks about, we've begun to shift more into what he calls the age of authenticity, or the ethics of authenticity, where instead of people looking to join these voluntary institutions to find meaning and purpose, they look inward on kind of a journey of spiritual and personal discovery that is often apart from institutions and organizations, right? So it's about expressing your true self by looking inward, a disembedding from institutions without necessarily re-embedding. And in that, we have the task of all of us in this culture of the age of authenticity of kind of discovering and performing and constructing our true self, right? And so there's a deep criticism and skepticism of institutions that has emerged in the age of authenticity. We might say some of that is really well warranted because the age of association institutions have been very exclusive. They've full of humans. They've done all kinds of, oppressive things over the years, for sure. But this shift of ages is where the church finds itself, I think, in this moment. And it's not just the church. If you talk to people who are involved in scouting or, service organizations like Rotary or vet organizations, all of those things are facing the same shift. So let's drill into this a little bit more on the next slide. And if we have in many of our congregations a legacy generation for whom the voluntary association model really works, right? It's normal, they get it. You ask them to serve on your church council or on a committee and they'll show up and they'll do it. Ask them to make a pledge, they get that. And for many of them, the social contract has basically been that their discipleship, their faithful church life has been expressed and channeled into supporting the institution, right? To volunteering, giving, all of those things, showing up, being an active member. And alongside that, there's also been what we talk about as a performative model of ministry or performative model of spirituality, in which the expectation is that the clergy, the ministers and staff, etc., perform the faith for the people, rather than a more participatory model where everyone is expected to know how to read the Bible, pray, talk about, Jesus with their neighbors, et cetera, et cetera. So functionally, for many of these age of association congregations, the work they do in their members' lives is primarily social, cultural, or community service. It's where they find their friends, it's where they pass on certain cultural traditions, and it's where they can volunteer and do community service. However, for those who are generally in emerging generations, who are living more in the age of authenticity, it's quite a different approach and paradigm, right? Where people are looking for authentic spiritual community and practice. I think we could critique the age of authenticity in many ways on theological grounds. And yet the impulse, I think, toward authentic spiritual community and practice is a good one. People are looking for trustworthy communities in which to, explore the big questions of life, not necessarily to have someone give them answers, but really to be able to dig in themselves. And particularly to bring the things that keep them up at night, what Scott Kermode talks about as longings and losses, to connect with the gospel, with the stories of the faith, with the stories of and practices of the tradition. So we live in between these two models, these two paradigms. And if you've tried to get people in emerging generations to formally join and pledge and serve on committees and all of that, that's a more and more difficult ask in this cultural shift. And then people in the older generation are often wondering, like, why don't people want to come and do what we have found so meaningful? And again, they just are what they are. These are just different approaches. It's not that one is necessarily better than the other, but churches are caught, I think, between sustaining the age of association model, often with fewer volunteers and resources, and trying to figure out what does it mean to be Christian community, to connect with people living in the age of authenticity. So at the same time, I think this is actually a wonderful time to be the church. It's a moment of really great opportunity because we live in what I think is a profound spiritual crisis in American society and American culture, where we can see all kinds of evidence of despair, ongoing injustice, just deep estrangement and polarization, divisions, sense of isolation and loneliness, and really kind of people's experience of meaninglessness. I think coming out of the pandemic, all of this is even more acute. What have been traditionally religious impulses toward things like, purity or righteousness or transcendence or community or even sin and forgiveness are now being channeled in secular forms, whether it be in politics, whether it be in diet or fitness or, all kinds of other vehicles by which those, basic religious impulses are being channeled. So the churches that are thriving in today's world are those that are actually helping regular people make spiritual sense of what keeps them up at night. And those that are actually deepening connections in the midst of so much estrangement, both with God, with each other, and their neighbors. And the faithful innovation journey that we're going to share about is really focused on that last thing. It's how do we learn how to deepen our connections with God, with each other in community, Christian community, and most importantly, with our neighbors. So in our book, we have a chapter entitled, Why Lydia Doesn't Go to Your Church. And one of the reasons, if Lydia represents those spiritually curious, but institutionally unaffiliated people, of which there are more and more in our world today, these are some of the reasons why.
Yeah, so one of the big shifts as you begin the faithful innovation journey and you're trying to figure out how to lead faithful innovation in a context, in a community, is you have to start by changing the questions you're asking and helping other people change the questions that they are asking. We are indebted to Alan Roxburgh's work on this for many years. He's been preaching this message of helping congregations shift from asking questions like, how can we get more people to attend our worship services? Or how do we attract more younger people to be part of our congregation so that the next generation will carry on our tradition? You could make a long list of church questions. Church questions are just any question where the church is kind of the primary subject of the question. And the shift is not that those are unimportant questions or that we shouldn't ask them or that they don't matter. Don't hear us saying that. But we're saying they're the wrong starting place. Instead, we want to invite you all to ask what Alan calls God questions. And those are questions that have God as their subject, right? What might God be doing in the lives of our neighbors? And I was remembering just real briefly a story of doing some work with some congregations out in Washington State in the Spokane area. And a congregation kind of lamenting that they didn't have many young people in their congregation anymore. And they were talking for a long time about like, what do we got to do? Do we change worship? Do we start a new youth group? Do we need a new youth pastor? Do we need fog machines? Like, what do we need to get the young people come to our church? And so I just said, hey, push pause on those questions and let's ask a different question. Like, what might God be already doing in the lives of young people in your community who maybe don't come to this church right now? And I want you to pause on that question for a second because it is so disorienting. It is really a big change for people to move from church questions to God questions. And as soon as you start thinking, well, what might God be doing in the lives of teenagers in our neighborhood or like people around our church? They initially go, I don't know. I don't really talk to any of the teenagers in our neighborhood, so I don't have any way to answer that question. And we would say like, okay, exactly, right? And in this really funny situation in Spokane, I had them doing this exercise where they're just walking around their church building, like just a couple blocks. And one of the teams went out that day, and lo and behold, there were all these teenagers in the park, like 2 blocks away from the church, who were getting ready to go to alternative prom, is what they called it. And these 70-year-old ladies end up talking to these teenagers who are going to alternative prom and asking them questions about their spiritual life, like, hey, what does God mean to you? And the teenagers were thrilled to start talking to them. And so they came back into the church building and were like, hey, we found the teenagers. They're across the street getting ready to go to alternative prom. So there can be so much freedom in changing from these church questions, which are often couched with guilt and feelings of failure, like we didn't do it right, or our job is to run this and it's not working as well as we want it to saying, no, our theological belief and assumption is that the God of the universe is already present and active in lots of the people's lives and all of the people's lives that we encounter, but we might have to move towards them in order to find out how God is actually active, instead of waiting for them to come into our church or doing everything we can to make our church ready for when they do enter the church. We believe God is calling us to step out in faith and find the places where God is already active in some of those relationships. So this means shifting your posture from trying to fix the congregation to being curious particularly about God's presence and activity. And lots of people are very uncomfortable with questions about God's presence and activity. And if that's where you start or people you're leading start, that's just fine. It's okay to be uncomfortable. And it's okay to ask questions about, like, how does anybody know what God's doing ever? Like, how does anybody have any certainty about that? Depending on the tradition you come from, you'd be more or less comfortable engaging with that question. That's just fine. But it takes our attention away from how do we fix the things that are broken in our church, and moves it towards, let's wonder together, let's move into some different physical spaces, some different online spaces, and let's be curious, particularly about how God might be active and present in some of those spaces. And so our source of energy and hope in this whole process, I hope you hear us emphasizing this, and it comes straight out of the story about Lydia, is that God is the real leader of the church in any part of the globe at any time. God is our source of energy and hope. The reason we have hope for the future of the church is not because we've come up with some really amazing techniques at Luther Seminary that we're going to teach all of you to do. It's rather that we believe the God of the universe actually has a move for all of us to make into the 21st century, and these amazing partnership opportunities that God wants us to, is inviting us to be part of as we think about the world and its needs and the gospel and the person of Jesus. But it's going to require us to come out of some shells that we've been in and take some risks and try some new things. But being faithful to God, assumes that God will be faithful to us. And that's where at least we get energy. We're not that energetic about fixing the church. We're particularly feeling energy and excitement and hope about the future as people continue to focus on what God's inviting them into next. So we're shifting our focus, as I said, from fixing the church. And in this particular story that Tessa read for us today, there's two kind of main points of listening. One, where does God want us to go next? What does God want us to do? How do we know that? How do we discern that together as a group and not just assign it to one person or one small group of people? So that's a whole set of practices that we talk about in the book. And then listening to Lydia. Who is Lydia in your context? Who is the unaffiliated, spiritually curious neighbor, one way we describe Lydia, who may not wander into a church building, but is maybe praying outside in nature, seeking God or seeking the universe or seeking meaning in their life? And how does anyone find that person, come into relationship with them, learn from them as Paul learns from Lydia, and also share with them some of what we have learned about who God is in the person of Jesus? So we want to just hit pause on fixing the church, as important as that can be, and say, what if we listened to God? And what if we listened to Lydia? How would that move us into the future? And so our process of faithful innovation, just to be clear about what we mean by that, is that it's a process of learning new ways to embody Christian identity and Christian purpose in a changing cultural context. All of our cultural contexts are changing constantly. They probably will continue to change. So this isn't a, hey, let's fix this, and then it'll be fixed for the next 100 years. Like, we'll change it and then we'll freeze it again and it'll be ready to go. It's actually learning this kind of constant adaptation, reminding ourselves of what our identity is as Christians in Jesus, and also learning to continually discern the purpose that God has for us as we move forward. So faithful innovation is about practices. It's about adopting practices and habits that allow the treasures of the Christian tradition, the things that we've known and held on to for centuries, to speak in a fresh way today. And it often involves the rediscovery of ancient spiritual practices, ways of reading the Bible, ways of praying, ways of engaging in neighborhoods and justice questions, as we also embrace some new technologies. So when you hear the word innovation, we hope you don't hear invention. We're not trying to invent anything new. We're helping people adopt new practices in their community, or practices that are new to them in their community. And that means we're paying attention to moments where things are breaking down. One way to think of a breakdown is anytime you're spending more and more energy to get kind of the same or less results, in an area of ministry that you're working in, that's a breakdown, right? Something's not working the way that it used to. Innovation involves helping to invite people into a different story. It's really different to say, we need you to come to our church and volunteer on this team, to say, we need you to come and be part of our church, which is focused on helping you discover what God's calling is in your life and where are the opportunities for you to participate in God's mission. So innovation involves fostering these new practices, like just trying these things out with everybody, not explaining it to them for 7,000 hours and then maybe trying something, but actually just getting into it and testing some practices that we outline in the book and just seeing what you learn by doing those things. And then finally, addressing resistance, which there will be lots of resistance from folks who really feel loss from these new practices, or they feel fear about what the future might look like if our church tries this or does this or changes in this way. And having some tools as leaders to help people process the grief and the loss that comes as a way of helping them move through that and into some of these new practices that we outline in the book. And so the faithful innovation process, as we've outlined it in this text, is really simple. We tried to boil it all the way down to these 3 steps that can be really clear and easy for everybody to remember. They have layers to them, but in sum, this is what they are. And we start with listening to God, listening to each other, listening to our neighbors. Out of our listening work, we try some new things. So we don't like committee our way to some new actions. We start behaving our way into new thinking right away. So we listen and we say, what should we try based on our listening? Then after we've acted, we share. And we share with each other, like, here's what we did and what we learned. And also we share transparently with people outside our community about what we're up to so that they can see and watch and potentially join what we're doing. And so we're going to just spend a little bit of time breaking each of these down. And Tessa's going to start by describing the listen step in a little more detail.
Thanks, Michael. So what do we mean by listen? As Michael already mentioned, we're talking about listening to God, listening to each other, and listening to our neighbors. And by our neighbors, we are talking about the people in our communities and neighborhoods and our Lydias, the people in our contexts who are seeking God, but they're not necessarily affiliated with our community. And when we're doing this listening work, we keep our attention on God, and we notice what God is doing among us and out in the world. We listen to each other as we talk about God's activity in our lives. And we pay attention to what keeps our neighbors up at night. This is important. Their fears, their worries, their concerns. And we try to meet them right where they are. We do our listening in community with each other. Now you'll see that one of the key practices listed here is dwelling in the Word. And this is where we listen to God together through Scripture. So in this practice, we read a specific text together and we ask questions like, what is it that catches your attention in this text? What questions does the text raise for you? And what do you think God might be saying to you through the text? So we do that in community with each other. And as we listen to each other's responses, the experience of hearing each other shapes us, the text shapes us, and Scripture becomes God's message to us and to our congregations. So we are not just the interpreters of the text is interpreting us as we read it, as we listen to it, as we engage with it in community. Now, for some of you who know me, this practice is very near and dear to me because I get the privilege of leading Faith+Lead's Dwelling in the Word webcast every week. We started gathering before the pandemic, but now we have a faithful group who gathers with our team every Tuesday at noon Central Time, and we explore that week's lectionary tasks. And what I love so much about this group is that we have developed this online supportive community. It's a community that transcends denomination and geography, a community that comes together across boundaries to listen together to God for what God is speaking to us through the text. And we are truly ecumenical. We have people who have a wide variety of theological perspectives and religious backgrounds, and yet we are able to talk to each other about Scripture, about what our traditions bring, and about what we're hearing. And I think that this is what the family of God is truly meant to look like. And this practice brings me joy. This community brings me joy. And because I love it so much, I encourage you to consider checking us out. We're going to put a link in the chat so you can, and there it is now, so you can learn more about this community. You're encouraged to and welcome to come check us out online whenever you want, every Tuesday at noon Central Time. So just give that some thought. Like I said, this practice is extremely meaningful for me, and I'm very, very grateful for the people who attend each week. So I want to say a little bit more about what listening actually is. And so here are some of the characteristics of listening. Listening is about noticing where God is already at work. So this might be where God is showing up in unexpected places and through unexpected people. We have to surrender sometimes some of the things that we're expecting that God would do, or some of the places where we expect God to show up. This might be God showing up outside the walls of the church, out in the community, and through people that we never would have imagined God speaking through. So sort of surrendering those expectations. And then listening is active rather than passive. This is an intentional practice, and it requires an increase of our spiritual awareness so that we can notice where God is at work and on the move. And we have to actively look for it. This might mean making space in our lives and in our ministries to do the listening work. So that could mean pausing or dropping programs in our churches and our ministries so that we can create space and openings so we can look for what the Spirit is up to. And of course, listening relies on the Holy Spirit. This is not about our own plans or ideas. It's not about necessarily what our committees are coming up with, but it is about really sitting together in community and listening for what God is inviting us into. Now, it might not be obvious right away. So this might require some patience and some waiting, because God's timing is not necessarily ours. Listening takes place inside and outside of the church. Michael alluded to this already, with the people inside in our congregations and with the people outside in our communities and neighborhoods. And of course, listening is happening in the context of community. And as Michael mentioned too, this is the step of faithful innovation where we start that move from asking church questions to God questions. Not, how can I fix my church? How can I make this better? But where is God at the center of this? What is God doing? How can we join God in the work that God is already doing? Now, listening to God is not always clear, and this is important. So the language that we use around our listening really matters. It's not necessarily God said this, but it's more invitational. God might be saying this. The might in that statement leaves this opening for interpretation and conversation around what God is doing. And as Michael mentioned, if you happen to come from a tradition that's less comfortable with listening for God, this is a helpful practice because it leaves some ambiguity and it leaves God some space to work. And then this kind of listening is also about leaders creating space for the people in our congregations to do that exploration of what God is communicating. So one question that leaders can ask of the community is this what we're hearing? I like that this language is all around, let's explore this together. Let's imagine together. And it really does give space for the Spirit to work. And then again, when we're talking about listening to our neighbors, we do mean the Lydias in our community. These are the people who are spiritually curious, but they're not necessarily affiliated with a church or with a community of faith. But the key thing here is that they are seeking God in some way. So we are meeting them where they are, and we're showing up when we are responding to the inquiries that they have, and we're helping them explore and figure out what their next step is. Now, on this next slide, I've got a pair of listening chairs because this is an example of being present in the neighborhood and listening and noticing how God is at work. So this is something that Michael actually did. He bought a pair of plastic Adirondack chairs like you see here, and he committed to spending part of the day sitting in them in his front lawn, about 30 minutes each day. And that got the attention of the people in the neighborhood. It opened up opportunities for conversation and relationship. I want you to know that listening can just really be that simple. These practices are simple. They're accessible. Anyone can do them. They don't have to be hard. You know, my own church we experimented with listening by hosting an evening of spiritual storytelling. We had never done that before, and it was a profound experience for us. A panel of women told stories about the times that God was most active in their lives, and we listened and we discovered new things about the way God is at work in our community. So the practice deepened the relationships of our community, and we now hold these personal stories about each other. The chairs in the front lawn, the storytelling practice, these are just some very brief examples of experiments. And that is part of the second step of faithful innovation, which is ACT. And Dwight is now going to take us through what that step involves.
Thanks, Tessa. So out of the listening that we do, which includes things like doing walks in the neighborhood, we do very simple, inexpensive experiments that are designed to connect us, to invest presence and relationship with neighbors. So neighborhood-based experiments that are very simple and replicable that we can learn from. So the goal of the experiments is simply to learn. And so, so again, if you go to the next slide, I mean, the experiment process is very simple. Like, what is it that we want to learn? What are we curious about? What are some simple steps we can take? And then how are we going to make sure that we have a feedback loop to learn from whatever happened and to reflect on it? So I want to give you just a few stories here of examples of what we mean when we talk about these experiments. So one is from a church in Chattanooga, Tennessee, in a context downtown where there was a lot of construction going on and change. And so during a town festival, they put out a table with strips of cloth and Sharpies, and they invited their neighbors to write a prayer on the strip of cloth and then to hang it on this construction fence. And they were there to pray with someone if they wanted to or talk to someone, but it was very simple. So, so they did this, and they found that their neighbors were really interested actually in sharing their prayers. And they did it once, they did it multiple times. They ended up collecting hundreds of prayers from their neighborhood. And actually, the bottom left picture is an altar cloth that they wove those prayers into so that they would literally celebrate the Eucharist over the prayers of their neighborhood. But this was also a listening exercise because they began to understand more deeply what their neighbors were struggling with and yearning for. So that's an urban story. I'm going to move to a rural story, and that would be a church in Wisconsin that was literally just surrounded by farm fields, cornfields, and things like that. When they did their walk or drive around their neighborhood, they just said, well, I wonder what God's up to in the lives of these farmers. And so their experiment was to take lunch to the farms that are near their church and just to approach and say, and offer the lunch, bag lunch to the farmers and say, can we pray in thanksgiving for you for feeding the world? And they didn't know if they'd get thrown off the farms or what would happen, but the neighbors actually, the farmers really loved this. And then their next step was to go to the grain elevator at harvest time and to set up a table and offer coffee and hot chocolate, and then be there to pray in thanksgiving for the harvest as the farmers brought their crops in the fall. And this was so meaningful to the farmers that the farmers said, well, can you come back in the spring and pray over our fields when we're sowing? And so again, two very simple, small experiments just based on what's going on in a context. I'm going to turn it over to Michael to tell a story of a different experiment that went a little deeper.
Yeah, I'll give you the short version. We outlined some of this in the book as well, but in the picture that you see in front of you is a kind of nondescript building in Northeast Minneapolis. And a number of years ago, when we were starting Mill City Church in Northeast Minneapolis as a new church in the neighborhood, we had the regular habit of walking the neighborhood and just asking God to show us what we should notice. And there was a team, I was not part of the team, but there was a team that noticed this building, ended up sort of wandering in the front door and finding out that this is a building that was built to house folks who are experiencing HIV and AIDS and also have a low income experience in their life. And it's built in a nondescript way to protect the residents. They just noticed it. We prayed about it. We filed it away as like something to know about the neighborhood. Not that long after that, we got a phone call from the building, from the manager of the building, saying that she got referred to us from a neighborhood newspaper who she asked, like, what's a church that might want to partner with us or help us? And the newspaper said, well, we've heard about this church that's engaging the neighborhood, so call them. And they wanted to do some Christmas baskets for their residents, and so we helped them put that together. And then after that, we actually asked permission to see if maybe we could start gathering in the space and engaging with some of the community members in their little community room. And over a period of time, some relationship built. a year or two went by, and then the neighborhood association that the building is in called the church and said, hey, we've got a pile of money from some billboards that we have rented nearby this building. And we've gotten a lot of the homeowners to respond on how they think we should spend the money, but we're having a hard time getting these residents to just give us their opinion so we can hear their voice on where they think the money should go as members of this community. And we heard that your church has a relationship with them. So we're wondering if, if you could help us to throw a party that would invite the residents so that we can just ask them their opinion about where this money should go. And one of the persons on our staff told me this story, and I was thinking, like, so just so I have this straight, the neighborhood called and said they have some money that they want some folks who are sometimes marginalized and hidden away to hear their voice and where that money should go. And they want a church to throw a party to invite those people to have their voice heard. And she said, yeah, I think that's it. So they gave us a couple $1,000s, and we threw this party in the courtyard with like games and food and music, and people came out and they filled the survey out, and everybody celebrated. It was just a really special moment. This story has so many layers. I'm just going to fast forward to the final piece of it, which is over years, a handful of people in our church continued to build relationship with this community. And as often happens, sadly, in this building, a resident passed away, and then we were invited. One of our pastors, Pastor Stephanie, was invited to come and actually perform the funeral in the building over this person who had Christian faith and wanted to celebrate their Christian faith as part of their funeral in their community. So you go from just wandering the neighborhood and wondering what God is up to, all the way to be invited by God's Spirit to really participate in these dear moments in people's lives and to build these deep relationships and even help to be about some justice causes in some of the neighborhoods, questions and concerns, which is just a beautiful thing that maybe God would lead us to do, but it starts with paying attention and asking some God questions. So the last step in our process is the step of sharing. So if we're doing some listening, we're trying some things, share is so important. Not in two ways, right? Sharing, like in terms of reflecting, like what did we do and what did we learn, and creating space for people to process as they're trying these things out about how they felt and what they thought God might be doing and where they were nervous and what they were learning. That's so important. But I'm also convinced that sharing publicly with the larger congregation, but also outside the congregation, I think people are desperate to hear stories of churches and spiritual communities who are trying some things that they maybe don't expect them to try. Instead of every story being about how the church messed something up or didn't do something right or fell down in some way, shape, or form, like what if some of the stories were just, hey, we're experimenting with this, and if you have any insights or input or want to join us, here's what we're up to. Transparent, online, letting people know this is what this church is about. Learning to do that and not think it's only for your congregation could really start to repair the reputation of the church in lots of neighborhoods where it desperately needs some repair. So that's the listen, act, and share process. And we're going to turn it back to Tessa for a brief description of some spiritual practices that you can engage in to go on the faithful innovation journey.
Thanks, Michael. If you can jump us ahead one more, Alicia. Perfect. Thank you. Spiritual practices are at the heart of the faithful innovation process. They are ancient ways of experiencing God. They help focus our attention on God's presence and activity in our lives. Because, it's true that we develop affection for whatever it is that we focus on, whatever it is that captures our attention, whatever we allow to fill our time. So the practices counteract our impulses to spend our time on the things that take us further away from God. The way that I always define spiritual practices is that they are tools that place us in God's presence so that God can do transforming work within us. And notice that this is God's work. We don't change ourselves, but God changes us as we spend time with him. And this change includes expanding our imagination of what it means to be the church. Spiritual practices are the means for our spiritual growth, which in turn benefits our communities as the people in our congregations grow as Christ followers, as disciples of Jesus. The practices are meant to be practiced. And the best way to learn about them is to do them. And thankfully, God invites us to do that. So on the next slide here, we have some practices that we've included in the book. These range from dwelling in the Word to the spiritual journey conversations and prayer walks to being present with other people and naming where God is inviting us to join Him. Besides those practices, the ones that are listed here in the 3 steps, we also highlight some other practices in the book like Sabbath, Ignatian Examine, Simplicity, Lament. We do this because we want to invite you to explore the possibilities. There's so many practices, but we want you to explore the possibilities of what God might be calling you to do in your community and in your own spiritual journey as a leader. So I'm not going to outline the details of these practices, though that's in the book, but we just want to make you aware that there's quite a bit to choose from. It's kind of like a menu. And because faithful innovation influences how we lead, I want Michael to touch on that next. So we'll just go there very briefly.
The summary of it is that the leadership shifts from being the performer of ministry for people and becoming somebody who's primarily focused on equipping other people to do the things that God has called them to do. Just like Paul empowers Lydia right away to follow what God is leading her to do and taking charge of the church. This is super countercultural. Everybody expects the pastors to do everything. Pastors are trying to equip other people, and it requires some conversations to say like, hey, my job is to join you in this work, but also to equip you to do the things that God has called you to do as you participate in God's mission.
All right. So I want to turn us over to some conversation for a few minutes with 2 guests who have been engaged in this faithful innovation work at the grassroots level. Pastor Matt Short, who is the assistant to the bishop for evangelical mission in the Greater Milwaukee Synod of the ELCA, and the Reverend Holly Rankin Zaher, who's the rector or lead pastor of St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Evansville, Indiana, and who has also worked within the Diocese of Indianapolis in this work. Welcome, Matt and Holly. So glad to have you with us. And I'm going to begin with Matt, and just if you could just share a little bit about how you've been involved in the Faithful Innovation work and what difference it's made in your context.
Yeah, thank you so much. As a part of the Synod staff, our Synod actually went through a mission vision, and practices rewrite a number of years ago and identified curiosity as a core value of the Synod. That led us to be learning a bunch more from Alan Roxburgh, who you referenced earlier. And that led us into conversation with Dr. Zscheile and Michael Binder around what that would look like. So I think we first went to a judicatory level coaching back in 2018, I want to say, where we learned what it would look like to gather a group of congregations in the Synod together around some of these paradigm shifting practices. So that's how we first got engaged. We've done a number of cohorts of congregations, and now we're really starting to dream about all sorts of other entry points, video series and other things that can just introduce the basic practices. We've really been touched by the wisdom that we don't think our way into new behavior, we behave our way into new thinking. And so we're trying to, it's actually affected every aspect of how we live as Synod level leaders, because we get invited into congregations, and rather than the fix, it actually helps slow the process down so that we are able to dive into reflection about God's activity instead of just kind of the frenetic pace of human activity to fix the church. So that's how we've been involved.
Wonderful. And Holly, how about you? You've done this both in the local church and also within a diocese.
Right. I got involved through, first of all, being involved with the missional leadership cohort, which was also put on by Luther Seminary, and then being trained. I believe I was at the same judicatory training that you were at, Matt, which is good to see you. And so that training, I became a facilitator for our diocese, but my church also has been a participant every cycle that we've done. Most other churches, in fact, all other churches that have gone through the Faithful Innovation learning community process in our diocese, usually at this point have done it once. I've found it really helpful that we do it every round, because I want as many people in my context to have access to this way of being, this way of doing discernment. And so that has been incredibly helpful, to have this kind of language and this kind of way of being kind of permeate who we are. So we've been doing this on our vestry, our board level, on a different way. We've been doing it in my congregation, and I've been working with the diocese to co-facilitate the Faithful Innovation learning communities, probably since 2018 or so.
So Holly, let me ask you a little more around what difference have you seen in terms of kind of energy, behavior, either in your own congregation or in other congregations who have taken this journey?
I really have seen, I think the easiest way is for me to reflect on my own congregation, right? And so I really have seen the beginnings, I will say the beginnings, but the beginnings of a shift, a cultural shift, right? From the fixing mentality to the discernment as a way of life. I'm not saying we're there yet. We're so not there yet, right? But it's a shift. It is, and it's huge. It is so necessary. I mean, I walked in here as the new rector in December of 2017 with this mentality, and knowing that the world has changed, and now I no longer have to explain myself. That is an established reality, right? Everybody knows that, as that's an assumed reality now. This is the best snapshot I can give you. There was a woman in her late 70s in the beginning of this process where she was convinced the best thing we needed to do was to buy a mailing list, and that would make sure that would solve that would fix all of our problems, right? Because that would bring everybody to the church. And I said, no, we're not doing that. I said, tell me who you know in our neighborhood that would come in. She said, well, I don't know anyone. I'm like, well, let's start meeting them. Well, how do I do that? Well, then I invited her to be part of Faithful Innovation learning communities. She took up the idea of sitting in the yard. So she sat in the courtyard. She finagled other people to sit with her. The next thing you know, she's asking people who are walking by how we could pray for them. She is in my face. Please, let's put them in the prayer request section. We've got to pray for them on Sunday. But it's changing her perspective. It totally changed how she saw our neighborhood. Someone in her late 70s. It was phenomenal to me. And that's just a snapshot of how it's impacted my community. So it's been pretty phenomenal.
Thanks, Holly. Matt, what about you? You want to speak a little more to kind of what difference you've seen in your synod and in the congregations, or any particular stories that come to mind?
Yeah, I was actually just with a congregation, like 4 weeks ago, and it was one of the congregations, and a lot of us are in this place of thinking through, okay, we know things are changing, but we're really not sure what to do about it. And I went and facilitated this very conversation. And the biggest difference that I see is when we get, especially in the trainings, but even in these one-off conversations that I will have where I'm invited in as a synod staff person, I see a release of energy that doesn't happen when we're sitting and talking, when we're asking church questions, and when we're trying to think about how to fix the church. That is kind of an energy drain in most circumstances. But I see exactly the opposite. Like, without fail, every single time that we gather, especially lay leaders together, and especially if they're from different congregations, and we start by asking God questions and sharing stories of where we've seen God active and where God might be leading us, there is this unleash of energy that I can only blame on the Holy Spirit. every single time. It is absolutely predictable. It is the thing that we look most forward to, is seeing, even after an 8-hour training, if we do like an all-day Saturday thing, even at the end of that, people are energized. They leave. And I think, and here's why I think that is. There's my bachelor's was in sociology, and there's a sociological principle that says words create worlds. So if you change how you speak, it actually begins to change the culture. And when we speak about God's activity, it reminds us that we're not, a lot of times I think we become functionally atheist in the way that we speak about the church, because we put it all on us. We've got to fix this. And as you noted earlier, Michael, then there's shame and other things that we carry when things aren't quote unquote working. But when we shift and speak about what God's doing, then all of a sudden we see a much bigger context, and there is this release of energy and optimism and excitement and genuine curiosity about where God's leading the church. So that's what I see without fail every single time, especially from lay leaders, but also from ordained ministers, is just a sense of hope.
Thanks, Matt. That's what we've seen as we've worked with directly or indirectly with hundreds of congregations in this journey over the years, is exactly that sense of energy and hope, partly because you're inviting people into a very different kind of journey than simply, sort of trying to sustain the existing church programs and activities, for instance. So thank you so much for sharing. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for Q&A, which is very much part of the design of this webinar. I'm going to turn it back to Alicia, who's got a bit more to share, and then we'll go into some Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Dwight. One of the things that we have been talking about throughout this webinar is that, the problems that face the church today, they're not Googleable solutions. They don't yet exist. And we really believe that the only way to genuinely discover a new way forward is through experimenting and trying things that maybe we haven't tried before, which is why we have equipped hundreds of congregations and over 50 judicatories with the Faithful Innovation process. And as you heard from Holly and Matt, the transformative effect happens not just at a judicatory level, but also at a congregational level. And it's a process that really involves incredibly simple and doable practices that are accessible to everyone, no matter what different practices your faith tradition has held. So if you're wondering today what your next steps might be as a congregation or judicatory, and you'd like us to help walk you through the Faithful Innovation process, then we have a couple opportunities that are coming up that we would love to share with you. First, we have a process for individual congregations, regardless of location, to be trained online and connected together to learn how to take this journey. We provide the coaching and walk you through the step-by-step Faithful Innovation process to go with you as you discern in your congregation what God might be up to and inviting you into. So our Faithful Innovation online community is available on demand, meaning you can join this process whenever you and a handful of people in your congregation are ready to engage it. It's a 10-week Faithful Innovation sprint. You get full access to all of our Faithful Innovation online video modules, as well as our Faithful Innovation workbook, monthly coaching and Q&A calls, and a private, non-judgmental community on our Faith+Lead platform where you can connect with other congregations who are on this journey as well. So if you'd like more information about that, we'll put the link in the chat. And then for judicatory leaders, we have a Train the Trainer cohort. We have one coming up that starts in June. And as part of this cohort, we equip you to facilitate the Faithful Innovation process for your congregations in your judicatory. So you also have full access to all of our training modules, workbooks, facilitator manuals, And the 6-month training process includes 2 in-person equipping retreats for 4 leaders from your judicatory, as well as 2 prepare to launch coaching calls and a 12-month membership to our Faithful Innovation judicatory coaching cohort. So you receive ongoing coaching as you are facilitating the process throughout your judicatory. If you'd like more information about that, you can also visit our website, and we will put the link to that in the chat. I want to mention a couple other resources for you. Our Pivot podcast, if you haven't yet had a chance to listen to season 3, which we released in 2022, then it is all about faithful innovation. And we interviewed a number of people in congregations and in judicatories who have engaged the faithful innovation process and how it has made a difference in their context. So we invite you to check that out, and we'll put a link to that in the chat. And then this year's season 4 is all about fresh expressions of church and includes a number of conversations and interviews with people who are engaging fresh expressions and a mixed ecology that you can learn more about by listening to Pivot season 4. We obviously also have our newest book, Leading Faithful Innovation, that we are very excited to celebrate the release of today. And so you can get that book wherever you buy your books. And then we have our Faithful Innovation Leader Companion, which is really a companion guide for leaders whose congregations are going through and engaging the faithful innovation process. It lays out a number of different practices that you can engage with your congregation that will just continue to further support the real culture change that takes place as you and your congregation are discerning what God is up to and might be inviting you to. So right now, I would love to open it up to a time of Q&A. So we are going to we're going to go to the Q&A, and here's a question that really speaks to what we talked about at the very beginning of the webinar, and that is this mix right now of the age of authenticity and the age of association. And so the question is really, what might you say or speak to with the tension of leading between the age of association and the age of authenticity? So maybe Dwight, I'll invite you to respond to that.
Sure, that's a great question. It's hard to straddle these two worlds because they come with different expectations. So one of the things we talk a lot about in the book and in the workbook is how do you reframe people's expectations? Because some of those expectations are helpful and others are not so helpful if you actually want to help the congregation deepen its connections with God, each other, and their neighbors. So part of that means, you certainly have to meet certain expectations, love people where they are, and reframe the conversation. So when people are really expecting you to fix the church, for instance, to sustain an age of association model that isn't actually going to be sustainable in the future, what we've found is that introducing these grassroots practices by which people begin to learn how to ask God questions, experience the energy that Matt was talking about, and Holly as well, of doing the practices that connect with neighbors, sharing their spiritual stories, engaging scripture in new ways, that there's energy that gets unleashed in that people find very life-giving. And when they experience that, the fixing the church conversation becomes less urgent for them because they're actually joining in this adventure with God and making new connections with their neighbors. And they're able to hold some of those institutional questions a little more lightly. So this is adaptive work. And, as Ron Heifetz says, anytime you're doing adaptive work, as a leader, you're going to disappoint people's expectations, but you have to do that at a rate that people can tolerate and stand. Otherwise, you lose your leadership. So that's the art of doing this. We think of it as starting small on the side with people who are willing to try some new things, getting them doing the simple practices that are energizing. They then influence their peers in the congregation, and new possibilities emerge even in the midst of the old.
There's another question related to that, and it's a request for a real-life example of something from the association model that was allowed to drop away.
Michael, do you want to take this, or go ahead?
Yeah, sure. I can answer that. Well, thinking immediately of a presbytery, so a group of churches that are Presbyterian had the group of churches had 30 committees for various aspects of that system's life. And they worked over a couple of years to narrow it down to 3 teams. Finances and ministry relationship building pieces, and I forget the third team. But I think the real life whittling down is really hard because there's so many people who are passionate about particular things. And so instead of trying to cut all those things out immediately, it's much more helpful if you can get some energy going in a new direction and then kind of invite people from one to the other, or just kind of allow some things to fizzle out instead of trying to create a lot of conflict around 1 or 2 people who really care about one thing existing. But the reality is we can't do all this stuff. And so at some point we have to have some kind of respectful and hard conversations about where our resources are going and how time and energy and money gets spent in the life of the congregation.
Thanks, Michael. Are there any other, oh, I just saw another question. So here is one that I think a lot of people will be able to relate to. Our congregation shrank in numbers the past 3 years. We have heard that said about a lot of congregations, so you are not alone. How do we balance reimagining our model when building and grounds maintenance uses a lot of time, energy, and money? And I'll open it up to whoever would like to answer that.
Sure, I can take a pass at that, Alicia. So again, this is a common story that we hear from many places where we have, just sort of maintenance stuff that consumes so much time and energy in the congregation. So one of the things I think is important in this is whatever you can do to simplify both the kind of, again, as Michael was describing, those, whether it be committee structure or programs or activities that aren't actually helping people connect more deeply with God, each other, and their neighbors, to simplify that and then create some space for this other work that's important. And I think the questions around buildings and all of that are really tough because there's no quick fix to a lot of that. You can't just say, okay, we're just going to not maintain the building, or, in some cases it does mean maybe selling the building or whatever, but that's obviously a process that takes some time. In our work on this, we found that helping the congregation learn to ask God questions is the way to solve those other challenges, because then the building question becomes not sort of, well, what do we do with this building? But it's, what might God be leading us to do relative to what our neighbors are actually looking for and what the realities of the context are. And that can actually lead to a very different kind of journey. So one of our colleagues here at Luther, Grace Pomeroy, who directs our Stewardship Leaders program, is just completing a major research project on alternative business models and funding models for ministry. And she's done a lot of work with buildings. And one of the things that she's found is the churches that are actually successfully discovering more sustainable models are those that are really clear on that sense of their participation in God's mission. But if you start with simply, the facilities or finances questions, it's hard to get there. So these practices provide a way in to then be able to take up those questions. And I think it's, what's the minimal amount you can do time and energy wise in the meantime?
Thanks, Dwight. Here's another one that I think a lot of people will definitely relate to. How do you alleviate people's fears, worries, and concerns in a culture that is indifferent and even hostile to the gospel?
I'd like to start off with this one, and if Michael and Dwight, if you have something you want to add, go for it. But I just want to acknowledge the truth of this and how difficult this is. That's one of the reasons why we frame this in the context of relationship and why listening is so important. When you listen to people's fears and concerns and worries, wherever they are in relation to the gospel, you are creating that bridge with them, and you are building that relationship, and you are creating a posture of welcome. And I think that any of this work needs to start there. So that's what I would say initially. Michael or Dwight, do you have anything you want to add?
I just think it's very hard.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important to acknowledge that there are some really scary parts of this, and anxiety is very high for lots of people. And I think just naming that, one of the practices in the Faithful Innovation Leader Companion is, again, just a way to kind of lament and talk about that and work through it. There's no solving that, but there is a way to create space for people to kind of talk about it and move through it, so that they can find the courage to still move forward. And there's nothing wrong with continuing to honor what people have already done, as a way to help them build capacity for taking whatever risks God's leading them to in the future. But it's scary. There's no getting around it.
Thanks, Tessa and Michael. Here's a question from a congregation that is thriving in many ways. There are many guests. Giving is going well. There are children that are and youth that are active in the congregation, and things feel like they've kind of come back to pre-pandemic in the life of the congregation, if you will. The mission of the congregation is all about relationships with God, each other, and neighbors, and yet it still feels like they're living into the old model of church. They're in a small town in the Midwest. And so there's a curiosity about what it might look like then to lead for the future for their church and their community.
Yeah, I'll take this, Alicia, if I might. So again, we've seen congregations engage this journey from all kinds of different contexts and also places of seasons, if you will, in their life. Those that are really struggling. I mean, I know of one congregation in the Episcopal Diocese of Indianapolis that when the diocese approached them about being part of this, they thought the call was because the diocese was going to shut down their church. They were so small, and they ended up going on an amazing journey. We've also seen it with large congregations that are relatively healthy, but yet this question notes that, the model is worn, right? It may not be the one to move forward. So one of the things about these practices is that the work of actually asking God questions and doing these practices in the neighborhood opens up a different horizon. So one of the things we talk a lot about here at Luther, and we actually are featuring in season 4 of Pivot and have a bit of a discussion about in the book, is this concept of a mixed ecology of both inherited and innovative forms of church working together. And that's a paradigm that we learned from the UK, where they've been doing this really for the last couple decades. And they have fresh expressions of church that, and again, come out of either any type of local church, sometimes out of really thriving churches, who also realize that some of the old models of ministry aren't going to connect with neighbors in their context. And so fresh expressions are simple, mostly lay-led, neighborhood-based forms of Christian community that are designed for people who don't go to church and aren't going to come into the traditional structures. And they're best when they're connected to an inherited congregation or structure, right? Rather than just off on their own. And so churches that are even a position of strength and vitality, we found it's great to do something like fresh expressions, or even just to lean into some of these practices in order to discover how God might be leading the church into its next season of ministry, even if that season, that form of ministry might look quite different, or even it might be a blended form, a hybrid kind of form of inherited and innovative. And I think you can build on the energy and momentum that you have to do that. Or if you're in a church that really is struggling with more of a survival crisis, it's fine to start there either. So it doesn't really matter in that sense.
Thanks, Dwight. Here's another question that I know we can relate to, because we've heard this story told in different ways, but in very similar ways from a lot of congregations that we've worked with. In my experience as a pastor for 38 years, I have found many Lutherans uncomfortable talking about God or their faith God talk. I've been asking Bible study members to share highs and lows and God sightings, and there usually isn't much said about God sightings other than sunsets and birds. The challenge, I think, in my context is to get people to talk about their faith or even ask people what they think about God. How do we get people to do that? I think some think that that is more of a Baptist thing, depending on your denomination.
I can start if anybody else wants to jump in. Well articulated. Thank you very much. Yes, that's a common experience, especially with Lutheran circles. I think there's a couple of helps maybe. One is to start in the past, to help people talk about a significant time in their life where they have experienced God that's not the present moment. I think that sometimes makes some folks from the Lutheran tradition the most nervous. So if you say, looking back on your whole life, like when's a moment, which is one of the exercises in the Faithful Innovation Leader Companion, sharing spiritual stories, it's called. When have you seen God most present, or where have you experienced it, or when have you felt the most spiritually alive? Starting in the past seems to help. Talking about the Bible, concrete texts also helps. It's not like only about my experience, but about what is God saying through this text. And slowly, with a couple of practices like that, you can kind of move up to the point where a person might be more comfortable talking about God in their present everyday life. But there's definitely some capacity building that needs to happen there.
Thanks,
I just want to affirm everything Michael said, and the modeling and the practicing and sort of getting people used to this. I think that's really, really helpful. So yeah, thanks for that, Michael.
Absolutely. Here's another one. As an intentional interim pastor, the congregations I have walked with are anxious about whether a pastor will be available for call. How can Faithful Innovation address this anxiety and question?
I'll take a swing at that one. So, this is very common. Again, we're seeing across the church landscape in North America increasingly the reality that is the case in many places in the world where the church is actually growing and thriving, such as Africa, which is more and more of a lay-led, clergy-supported model rather than a clergy-led, lay-supported model, because there aren't enough pastors to fill the pulpits that are out there. And so I think on the one hand, in the question is something of a, churches do wonder, how can we find a pastor who's going to step in and do what we expect them to do, right, traditionally? And Faithful Innovation isn't going to solve that challenge. However, what it's going to do is build the congregation's capacity to exercise spiritual leadership. So what I've seen is a lot of people in congregations whose spiritual muscles, if you will, haven't been exercised as much by traditional congregational life, particularly in that performative model, through this process, through these practices, become much more engaged, grow spiritually, and then are able to step into forms of congregational leadership that maybe they weren't, comfortable doing before, because they are more comfortable now praying, talking about God, sharing faith stories, doing all these things that pastors are expected to be comfortable doing. And so, I think as this model of the paradigm of a primarily lay-led, but with significant clergy support, right? The role of clergy is to support the lay leaders, and that may be multiple congregations at a time, as is currently the case in many places. This becomes a way to actually grow the lay leadership, which is what we need actually for this new season we're in.
Thanks, Dwight. Here's a building question. And I think this will be our last one, and then we'll have a couple announcements and then close. So this is from a redevelopment pastor in Florida, and the congregation sold their building 4 years ago and are feeling like they need some sort of gathering space, but are imagining that it might be different than a church. So how might the the Faithful Innovation or Fresh Expression Faithful Innovation process help them imagine what might be next for them and their gathering space?
Is it okay if I try that one?
Go for it.
Okay, I love this question. Great question. And you're in a wonderful spot in that you've already moved through some important stages of letting go of a building that maybe didn't serve the ministry needs anymore. So my answer to your question is it really depends upon what the next season of ministry looks like for the congregation. So if you were to say, hey, we're doing this faithful innovation process, we're doing some listening, we're doing some actions, we're doing some sharing, what we're discovering is we really feel led by God to engage with the youth in our community. Okay, well, now we need to talk about like, how do we find space that helps facilitate our ministry to youth and maybe the community's ministry to the youth. And maybe we even buy some space that generates some income that helps us do the ministry that God's called us to do. But, you know, if it's something totally different, like we feel led by God to create a safe space for people outside of the church to ask their questions about God, well, then you're going to need a different kind of space for that. And it's really, it's putting the cart before the horse, not that you're doing this, but like in many congregation settings, like we kind of determine the space and then we try to figure out what ministry fits in the space. Well, you have this opportunity right now in the situation you're in to determine the ministry and then go get the space you need to facilitate that in the best possible way. And also think about it as being flexible so that if some of that calling shifts over the next years, maybe the space is flexible enough to shift with that. But ministry should determine space, not the other way around.
Thanks, Michael. It's a great question to end on. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. We will be sending out the recording of this webinar along with the links and resources to the resources that we talked about. And we also want to send you a free chapter of the Leading Faithful Innovation book. And so you can look for that in your inbox in the next few days. But again, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us in celebrating the launch of this book and really breathing a breath of fresh air of the Holy Spirit and continuing to join in what God is doing around not just this country, but around the globe today for the gospel. So thank you. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next time.